I never thought silence could sound like betrayal. But the night my father spoke in Evelyn's defense, while I sat there bleeding inside, I realized that silence could destroy more than words ever could. It was winter in Finland, the kind that presses against your chest and makes you remember things you've tried to forget. Snow covered everything that night, even the roads leading up to my father's mansion. Like the world itself was trying to bury what was about to happen. I had come there hoping for peace, hoping that maybe, for once, he'd look at me not as an employee in his shadow, but as his son, the one who still believed in love more than money. Evelyn sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing that same calm smile that used to warm me once. But that night, it felt rehearsed. Too perfect, too practiced. She had told him everything, our fights, my insecurities, even the ring I returned when I thought she wanted to leave. But she hadn't told him how I waited outside her office every night, how I listened to her when she cried over work pressure, or how I loved her enough to let her go when I thought she deserved better. My father didn't ask for my side. He didn't need to. In his eyes, success spoke louder than sincerity. And Evelyn, his favorite protege, had success written all over her. "Joshua," he said coldly, adjusting his gold cufflinks, "you've let your emotions interfere with your judgment. Evelyn deserves stability, not struggle. Maybe this is for the best." I remember staring at him, the same man who once told me that family was everything. But now, I couldn't find a trace of family in his eyes. Only calculation, only pride. Evelyn looked at me briefly then, a glance so brief it could have been an apology, or just a goodbye. I couldn't tell which. I left that night without saying a word. The snow outside crunched beneath my shoes, like the world breaking quietly under my feet. And as I walked away from both of them, my father and my fiancée, I realized something that hurt deeper than betrayal itself. They were not against me. They were together, and I was simply the silence that filled the space between them. When I think about how it all began, I still wonder if love was ever meant to survive between two people standing on opposite sides of the world. I wasn't poor, not exactly, just ordinary. I worked as a junior architect in a mid-sized firm in Helsinki. My salary could pay the bills, keep my tiny apartment warm, and buy coffee from the same corner cafe every morning. It wasn't much, but it was enough for peace. Evelyn was anything but ordinary. She was the kind of woman who made people stop talking when she walked into a room, not because of beauty alone, but because of the quiet confidence she carried. Her heels clicked like rhythm. Her smile seemed designed for diplomacy, and her eyes, they had this calm curiosity, as if she was always studying the world, deciding where she fit best. I met her during a presentation her company hosted, one of Mr. Jonathan's luxury real estate projects. She was representing her father's company, and I was there as a small part of the design team carrying rolled-up sketches and nervous hope. She noticed me before I noticed her. When she asked for a copy of my floor plan, I thought she was just being polite. But a week later, she showed up at my office, holding coffee and smiling like it was the most natural thing in the world. That's how it started. Evelyn never made me feel small, not in the beginning. We went for quiet walks by the harbor after work, where the air smelled of sea salt and cold metal. She loved how I saw beauty in simple things, streetlights reflecting on wet pavement, or the sound of church bells echoing through snow. She once told me, "You notice things most people forget to see. Maybe that's why I feel peaceful around you." I believed her. Her world was brighter, faster, and more demanding than mine. Business dinners, expensive clothes, endless calls. But when she was with me, she laughed differently, softly, freely. And for a while, I thought love was enough to bridge everything. The money, the expectations, even the unspoken warnings from her circle. Mr. Jonathan met me 2 months after Evelyn introduced me as her boyfriend. He didn't say much that day. He just studied me from across his office desk, hands folded, his gaze like cold glass. "So, you're the architect my daughter talks about," he said. His tone was polite, but distant, the kind of voice that sounds like a handshake you don't feel. I nodded and said, "Yes, sir." He smiled faintly. "Ambition is a good thing, Joshua. I hope you have plenty of it." I didn't realize it then, but that was his first test. From then on, I felt his presence everywhere in subtle remarks Evelyn repeated. In questions about my income, in sudden changes to her schedule. It wasn't direct, but I could sense the silent pressure she carried between us. Still, love made me stubborn. When I proposed to her one quiet evening under the soft yellow lights of Esplanade Park, she cried and said yes. The world felt small and perfect for a moment, just us, and the snow falling gently like blessings. We started planning a modest wedding. Nothing grand, just a gathering of close friends, my mother's old ring, and Evelyn's laughter echoing through it all. But her father had other plans. He wanted a ceremony fit for headlines, sponsors, and investors. He spoke to her more than he spoke to me, and somehow every plan we made became a version of his vision. Evelyn defended him, saying he just wants the best for us. I believed her again. The first real crack came a month before the wedding. Evelyn began missing dinners, answering calls in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact when I asked simple questions. She said it was work, a big deal her father trusted her to handle. But the silence between us grew. Our laughter turned to polite smiles, and our warmth turned into something fragile like glass you're scared to hold too tightly. And through it all, my father, Mr. Jonathan, kept watching from a distance, waiting for me to break the way he thought I eventually would. At that time, I still loved him. I still wanted his approval. I still believed that that family meant forgiveness, not competition. But I was wrong. Because soon, I would discover that the man I trusted most, my own father, wasn't just choosing sides. He was building one. Love doesn't end suddenly. It fades in quiet ways, unanswered messages, shorter hugs, smiles that stop reaching the eyes. That's how it happened with Evelyn. At first, I blamed the workload. She was managing one of her father's biggest projects, a luxury tower deal worth millions. She came home exhausted, shoulders tense, phone always in her hand. We still had dinner together, but she barely tasted her food. Her thoughts were somewhere else, always in a meeting, a plan, a conversation I wasn't part of. I tried to be understanding. When you love someone, you make excuses for their distance. You convince yourself it's temporary, that things will go back to the way they were. So I did what I always did. I listened, I waited, I stayed. But waiting can be heavy when silence starts to fill the room. One night, I came home early from the office. The apartment was dark, except for the faint glow of her laptop screen. Evelyn was sitting there, whispering into her phone. I didn't mean to overhear, but her tone made me stop. She said, "I know, he's not used to this world yet, but I can handle it. Just trust me." Her voice trembled, but not from fear. From guilt? When she hung up and saw me standing there, she froze just for a second. Then she smiled too quickly. "You're home early. Who were you talking to?" I asked quietly. "Work," she said. "Just work." Her eyes darted away, and I could feel the wall between us grow higher. That night, she lay beside me but kept her back turned. I watched her breathing in the dark, slow, steady, peaceful, and I realized something that hurt deeply. You can share the same bed with someone and still feel 1,000 miles apart. A few weeks later, my father invited us to dinner. It was supposed to be a family evening, as he called it, but family dinners in his mansion never felt like home. They felt like board meetings disguised as affection. The dining room was grand, too grand for warmth. The chandelier reflected in the polished table, and every sound seemed to echo like we were being watched. Evelyn arrived before me, already talking business with him. When I entered, she didn't even notice. "Joshua," my father greeted, his tone smooth but cool. "You look tired. Is everything all right at work?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just busy days." He leaned back, studying me. "You know, Evelyn's been helping me with the new expansion project. She's brilliant, sharp, efficient. Reminds me of her mother." I smiled faintly, but inside, something twisted. It wasn't the compliment that hurt. It was the comparison. I could hear what he didn't say, unlike you. Evelyn looked at me briefly, as if she felt it too, but she said nothing. She just placed her hand over mine under the table, a gesture that once meant comfort, now just confusion. Throughout dinner, they talked numbers, deals, and profits. I sat there silently, feeling smaller with every word. It was like watching the two most important people in my life build a world where I didn't belong. When we got home, I tried to talk to her. "Do you even realize how he talks to me?" I asked softly, like I'm an outsider, like I don't deserve to be here. Evelyn sighed. "Joshua, you take everything too personally. He just wants to help us succeed." "US?" I asked. "Or you?" She frowned. "You're being unfair." "Am I?" I whispered. Because lately, it feels like I'm the only one fighting for this relationship." She turned away. "You're tired. Let's talk tomorrow." But tomorrow came and went, and she never brought it up again. Months passed. The wedding was postponed twice, first for business reasons, then for family obligations. I stopped asking why. I noticed how Evelyn began dressing differently, sharper, more formal, more like her father's world than mine. She spent longer hours in his office, traveled with him for meetings, and sometimes didn't come home for days. When I asked where she'd been, she'd smile faintly. "You wouldn't understand, Joshua. It's complicated." But love shouldn't be complicated. It should be kind, simple, grounding. I started avoiding the mansion altogether. Every visit felt like standing in front of a mirror that showed me what I wasn't: rich, powerful, respected. Still, a small part of me kept hoping maybe she'd realize how far we'd drifted and come back. Maybe my father would see how much this was breaking me and finally step in as a father, not a businessman. But hope can be cruel. The breaking point came one snowy afternoon. I was called to my father's office, a rare event in itself. When I arrived, he was sitting by the window, watching the snowfall over the city like he owned it. Evelyn was there too, sitting silently on the couch. "Joshua," he said calmly, "we need to talk." I knew the tone. It was the same one he used before firing employees. He continued, "I've reviewed the financials of your project. The firm you're working with is struggling. You're talented, but you lack direction. Evelyn has offered to help by managing the investor side." I blinked. She offered. Evelyn looked away. "I just thought, maybe we could make it easier for you." "For me," I said bitterly, "or for him?" "Joshua," my father said sharply, "this is not about pride. It's about survival. You need to learn how to work with people who know more than you." I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because I finally understood. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about control. He didn't want a son who loved differently. He wanted an heir who thought like him. And Evelyn, she was becoming exactly that. I stood up slowly. "If this is what success looks like, I'll pass." My father didn't look up. "You'll regret that." "Maybe," I said, "but at least it'll be my regret, not yours." When I left the office, Evelyn didn't follow. She just sat there, her eyes wet but unmoving. That night, I packed my things and went back to my old apartment. No messages, no calls, not even a goodbye. For the next few weeks, silence became my closest companion. And in that silence, I started to see everything clearly: how love can be twisted into obligation, how family can become a transaction, and how even the strongest hearts can break quietly without anyone noticing. It was about a month later when the news broke. Evelyn had married, not just anyone, but Victor Hale, my father's fiercest business rival. The headlines read like poetry written in pain. "Billionaire's protege marries his competitor's son in private ceremony." I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold in my hand. The words didn't hurt at first. They just floated in front of me, meaningless. But then the photos appeared. Her in a white dress, smiling, looking radiant. And standing beside her was Victor, the man my father despised the most. I didn't cry. Not that day. I just sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, realizing that both of them, my father and Evelyn, had finally chosen their sides. But fate has a strange sense of balance, because sometimes losing everything is what finally sets you free. They say time heals, but I've learned that time doesn't heal anything on its own. It just gives you space to see things differently. For weeks after Evelyn's marriage, I lived like a ghost in my own life. I went to work, spoke when spoken to, smiled when necessary, but inside, everything felt hollow. I had stopped blaming her, stopped blaming my father, and started questioning myself. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe I was too simple for her world, too quiet, too patient, too unpolished. But one evening, as I sat by the frozen lake near my apartment, something in me whispered, "The truth isn't what you think it is." That whisper wouldn't leave me. It was late March when I received a letter, an actual letter, not an email, with no return address. The handwriting was delicate and familiar. Evelyn's. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Joshua, if this letter reaches you, please read it to the end. I owe you the truth, not for forgiveness, but for peace. What happened between us wasn't an accident. It was arranged. Your father came to me months before our breakup. He said he wanted to protect you. He told me your company was at risk, and that if I truly cared for you, I would step back, let you find your own strength, without my help. I believed him. I was foolish enough to think it was love in disguise, a test, maybe. But what I didn't know was that he was already in talks with Victor Hale. He wanted a merger, and I became the price. I didn't marry Victor for love. I married him because your father promised me it would save everything you'd built, that he'd invest in your company and secure your future. But after the wedding, he disappeared. I realized too late that I had been used by both men, one for power, one for pride. I'm sorry, Joshua. Truly, you are the only real thing in all of it. Please, live free of this. Don't carry me with you anymore. I read it twice. Then a third time. The words blurred, not from disbelief, but from the quiet ache of understanding. She hadn't betrayed me to hurt me. She had been trapped, just like I was. Only her prison was made of promises, not walls. And my father, he hadn't chosen her side out of love for her. He had done it to destroy a rival, to manipulate two hearts for his empire's sake. I felt no rage, no shouting storm inside me. Just a cold clarity, like waking up after a long, fevered dream. The next morning, I drove to my father's estate. It was early, frost still clung to the iron gates, and the air smelled of pine and distant snow. The guards recognized me and let me in, though their eyes flickered with surprise. He was in his study, as always, surrounded by walls of books he never read and paintings that looked more alive than he did. Joshua, he said, glancing up from his papers, I wasn't expecting you. I read Evelyn's letter, I said softly. He froze, just for a moment. Then, without looking up, he murmured, Ah, I see. You used her, I said. You lied to both of us. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. You're being emotional again. I did what was necessary. Necessary? I repeated, my voice calm. You destroyed two people's lives for a deal you didn't even keep. He looked at me then, eyes cold, sharp, like winter glass. You think love pays bills, Joshua? You think marriage survives on feelings alone? I gave you a chance to grow up. You refused, so I acted. I shook my head slowly. No, you acted because you were afraid. He frowned. Afraid? Yes, I said quietly. Afraid that I'd become something you couldn't control. That I'd build something honest, something real without your name on it. Silence filled the room like fog. For the first time, he didn't have an answer. I looked around his study, the empire he'd built, the cold perfection he lived in, and I realized how small it all was. All that wealth, all that power, and yet he had never learned how to love. I used to envy you, I whispered, but now I just pity you. He straightened, but his eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. You sound like your mother, he said. It was the first time he'd mentioned her in years. She left, I said, not because of money, because of this, the same emptiness you've carried all your life. He looked down. His voice dropped to a murmur. I built everything for you. No, I said gently. You built it for yourself. You just put my name on it. And with that, I turned to leave. He didn't stop me. For weeks after that, I started rebuilding my life. Not the business, not the career, just myself. I moved to a small cabin near the lakeside, far from the city lights. The mornings were cold but peaceful. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine. I spent hours sketching, designing, and listening to the wind move through the trees. Sometimes I'd get letters from people who admired my designs, local families who couldn't afford, big architects but wanted something beautiful. I started taking small projects, homes, schools, quiet places that held meaning. I didn't chase success anymore. I chased sincerity, and slowly, life began to feel warm again. One evening, about 6 months later, I got another letter. This one wasn't from Evelyn. It was from Victor Hale. It said only a few lines. Mr. Jonathan's empire is collapsing. Deals fell through. Investors pulled out. Evelyn left. She's gone abroad. I thought you should know. I read it, folded it neatly, and set it aside. There was no satisfaction, no triumph, just peace. My father had finally learned what I had learned long before, that control is an illusion. A few weeks later, I saw Evelyn again. It was in a small art gallery near the city. I hadn't planned it. I was just there to deliver sketches for a friend's exhibition. She stood in front of a painting of a frozen lake, the same one near my cabin. She turned, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Joshua, she said softly. Evelyn. We stood in silence, and I noticed she wasn't wearing her wedding ring. You got my letter, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I did. Did you hate me for it? I shook my head. No, you were honest, in the end. That's more than most people ever manage. Her eyes filled with tears. I wanted to come sooner, but I didn't know if I had the right. I smiled faintly. You don't need a right to seek peace. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I heard about your father. I know, I said quietly. Maybe now he'll finally see what really matters. She looked at me for a long moment. You've changed, she whispered. Maybe I finally started living for myself, I said. There was a pause, gentle, not painful. Then she smiled. I'm glad. We didn't hug. We didn't promise to meet again. We just stood there. To people who had once loved deeply, finally free from the weight of what was. When she walked away, I didn't feel emptiness anymore, just calm, like the closing of a long, aching chapter. That night, I went back to the lake. The ice was melting, reflecting the pale light of the moon. The air smelled of spring, fresh, uncertain, full of quiet beginnings. I realized then that sometimes love doesn't need to return to be forgiven. And forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing peace over pain. As I watched the water ripple under the moonlight, I whispered to myself, I lost her, but I found something better myself. It's strange how life finds balance on its own. No matter how far things drift, they eventually settle, not always where we expected, but where they're meant to be. Months passed after that brief meeting with Evelyn. The snow melted from the trees, and the lake behind my cabin began to breathe again. I spent most mornings sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, sketching small designs, homes that felt alive, not perfect, places where love could grow without being suffocated by walls of pride. My company, if it could be called that, was small. I didn't even have a proper name for it. People found me through word of mouth, a family here, a teacher there. I'd build their dreams in quiet towns. No publicity, no fame, just honest work. Sometimes people would ask why I left the city, why I gave up the comfort and prestige of big projects. I'd just smile and say, peace is worth more than pride, and I meant it. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the birch trees, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a woman's voice spoke softly. Mr. Joshua, I'm calling from St. Mary's Hospital. It's about your father. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I hadn't seen Mr. Jonathan in over a year. I didn't even know where he lived now. Rumors said he had sold the mansion after his company began collapsing. Investors turned their backs, partners withdrew, and his empire, the one built on fear and control, began to crumble silently, piece by piece. The nurse continued, he's stable, but weak. He asked to see you. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to refuse to let him live with the silence he had chosen. But another part, the part that still remembered the boy who once waited for his father's approval, whispered, go. So I did. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet grief. When I entered his room, I barely recognized him. The man who once seemed carved from stone now looked small, fragile, his hair completely white. The tubes and monitors made faint rhythmic sounds, like a heartbeat trying to remember its purpose. He looked up when I walked in. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled faintly. I wondered if you'd come. I wasn't sure I would, I admitted. He nodded slowly. I wouldn't have blamed you if you didn't. I pulled a chair beside his bed. The silence that hung between us wasn't angry anymore. It was tired, heavy with years of things left unsaid. How are you? He asked, his voice thin but steady. Alive, I said. At peace. He chuckled softly, a weak, rasping sound. Peace. I never quite learned that word. We sat there quietly for a while. The sunlight through the blinds cast thin golden stripes across his bed. It felt unreal, like time had slowed down just for us. He finally spoke again. You were right, you know. About what? About fear? He looked at me then, eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. I was afraid. Not of losing control, of losing you. I thought if I made you strong by my standards, you'd never suffer the way I did. But I only pushed you away. I looked at him, really looked. For the first time, I didn't see a billionaire or a tyrant. I saw a man, lonely, broken, human. I used to hate you, I said quietly, but now, I just wish you'd learn to love without needing to win." He nodded weakly. "So do I." Then he reached out his hand, trembling, hesitant. "I don't have much left, Joshua. But if you can, forgive me, not for what I did, but for what I didn't do. I'd die lighter." I took his hand. It felt cold, fragile, like a memory fading. "I already forgave you," I whispered. "The day I stopped trying to prove my worth to you." A tear slipped down his cheek, slow, unguarded. "You sound like your mother," he said again. "She used to say peace is a kind of wealth, too." "She was right," I said. He smiled faintly, eyes closing. "I'm glad you found it." He passed away 2 nights later, quietly, without pain. The nurse said he looked peaceful at the end, as if something inside him had finally settled. I didn't cry at his funeral. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because my grief was quiet, the kind that doesn't need tears to exist. I buried him beside my mother, in a small cemetery overlooking the lake. The snow began to fall lightly during the burial, soft, silent, forgiving. After the ceremony, I stood alone by his grave for a long time. "You never learned to live softly," I said under my breath. "But maybe now, wherever you are, you'll finally rest softly." In the weeks that followed, I found an old box among his belongings. Inside were letters, not business papers, not contracts, but handwritten notes. Some were from my childhood, my drawings, my school reports, even the first sketch I'd ever made of a house when I was 10. He'd kept them all, and beneath them, one short letter in his handwriting. "To my son, I never said it, but I was proud of you. Not for what you built, but for what you refused to destroy. Jonathan." I read it again and again until the ink smudged under my thumb. For the first time in years, I let myself cry, not out of pain, but out of release. Life after that became quieter, simpler. Every morning, I'd open my cabin windows and let the cold air in, reminding myself that peace isn't the absence of struggle, it's the choice to keep your heart open despite it. Sometimes, when I walked by the lake, I'd imagine Evelyn somewhere far away, maybe finally free from the world that once chained her. I didn't wish her back anymore. I just wished her peace, the same way I wished it for myself. A few months later, I received a letter from one of my clients, a young couple who had just moved into the small house I'd designed. They wrote, "Thank you for building our home with such care." There's something about it that feels alive, like it was built by someone who truly understands what love needs. That letter meant more to me than any award or headline ever could. Because maybe that's all I ever wanted, to build things that could hold love. Not luxury, not status, just love. As summer began to roll into Finland, the evenings grew long and golden. The light stayed in the sky until almost midnight, washing the lake in a soft glow. I'd sit outside, sketching in silence, listening to the gentle hum of life returning. One night, as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, I whispered the words that had been forming in my heart for months. "I forgive you, Evelyn. I forgive you, Father. And I forgive myself for holding on too long." The air felt lighter after that, like the world itself exhaled with me. Sometimes I still think of my father's last words, "I'm glad you found peace." Maybe that's the greatest inheritance anyone can leave behind, not wealth, not property, but a lesson learned too late. That peace is the only fortune that never fades. The seasons in Finland change softly, almost like a slow song you can't help but hum along to. By autumn, the trees around my cabin turned golden again, and I realized an entire year had passed since the night everything fell apart. But strangely, I didn't feel broken anymore. I had learned that healing doesn't come with grand gestures or miracles. It comes quietly through mornings, when the sun touches your window and you find yourself smiling without reason. Through nights when the silence doesn't feel like loneliness anymore, but rest. One evening, I walked down to the lake. The air smelled like pine and distant rain. The surface of the water reflected the sky like glass, so still it seemed afraid to breathe. I sat on the old wooden dock, legs hanging over the edge, and whispered a thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to life itself. For the pain, for the lessons, for every heartbreak that shaped me into someone softer instead of bitter. Because that's what love truly is. Not the fireworks, not the promises, but the quiet strength that remains after everything else burns out. I sometimes think about Evelyn, not as the woman who broke my heart, but as the one who showed me where it was fragile. I hope she found her own version of peace. Maybe a quiet home, maybe a child laughing somewhere near the sea. And my father, Mr. Jonathan. I visit his grave sometimes, bringing a small bunch of white tulips, his favorite, though he never admitted it.